The window of tolerance to stress arousal, we each have one. The width of it is determined over our life experiences. When we are inside our window of tolerance, we're at the arousal level that allows both our thinking brain functions and our survival brain functions to be fully online. Everybody's window is different. So our window is very important for our ability to function effectively and to go through stress and then be able to recover from it each time.
Welcome to the Field Dynamics podcast. We're here to facilitate inspiring dialogues about the nature of consciousness across disciplines, communities, and practitioners, all with a holistic perspective.
From energy healing to somatic therapies, from neuroscience to meditation, we believe the most interesting things happen at the boundaries of disciplines.
I'm Christabel.
And I'm Keith.
Thanks for joining us today and enjoy the episode.
Hello, and welcome to the Field Dynamics podcast. Today, we are joined by Elizabeth A. Stanley, PhD. Liz is a professor of security studies with joint appointments in the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service and the Department of Government at Georgetown University. She's the creator of Mindfulness-Based Mind Fitness Training, also known as MMFT, taught to thousands in civilian and military high-stress environments. MMFT research has been featured on 60 Minutes, ABC Evening News, NPR, and in Time magazine, amongst others. Liz is a speaker and award-winning author addressing a variety of topics related to resilience, decision-making, political psychology, civil-military relations, military effectiveness, and international security. She's the author of the books Widen the Window and Paths to Peace. She's also a certified practitioner of somatic experiencing, a body-based trauma therapy. As a U.S. Army veteran with service in Asia and Europe, she holds degrees from Yale, Harvard, and MIT. Liz, thank you so much for joining us today.
Keith and Christabel, thank you so much for having me. It's so wonderful to be here with you.
You're a U.S. Army veteran who once had a PTSD diagnosis, and now you find yourself as a teacher for stress resiliency and trauma recovery. Could you tell us a little more about your journey into the work that you do today?
Yes. I came to this work through my own history with stress and trauma. And I feel like it gave me a drive to do this work in a way that it just isn't an intellectual exercise. I was actually really trying to heal myself first, and through what I learned, wanted to then share it with others. In some ways, I'm kind of exhibit A of what I teach and write about in terms of the window of tolerance to stress arousal. I grew up in an alcoholic family, lots of childhood adversity, sexual violence through my youth and young years. Then I served in the military and stressful military deployments and had a near-death experience when I was deployed in Bosnia as a peacekeeper. And through all of that, I was coping the way I had been socialized to cope, the way most people in our society are socialized to cope, which is to say, I just shoved that stuff under and kept going. And it took a lot of willpower to do that, but it actually wasn't really addressing the issues at all in a direct way. And so it eventually started coming out sideways in my body. My body was bearing the burden of that denial and that override. And so I started getting really sick. And eventually developed insomnia, chronic respiratory infections, PTSD, as you said, depression. And it turned out I also had Lyme disease, but didn't know it. And so the wake up call for me was losing my eyesight for a period of time. And, being without eyesight was really kind of, okay, it's really time to do this differently. So started me on a long healing journey with the different practices and techniques that I teach and use in MFIT. That's how we pronounce that acronym. MMFT is MFIT. And did some of my own clinical training after seeing real effects with body-based trauma therapies in my own mind and body. And then we've researched MFIT with lots of different high stress populations. And I guess from this whole journey, I've learned that there's nothing that I didn't first kind of experience in my own mind and body before I started sharing it with others. And learning what I did about the way our minds and bodies worked really helped me take it much less personally. Like my body and mind were responding in a very lawful way to conditioning and to effects that once I understood the science of our neurobiology, it really both helped me take the shame and self judgment out of it, but it also helped me really see the places, the leverage points where we can interrupt that conditioning and choose something different. And that's what I wanted to share with other people.
An incredible background you're sharing there, Liz. I know we'd love to delve into some of the details of that a little bit further on. I wondered if we could start here by, from your perspective, simply defining trauma. Like, do we need neurological markers, or what definition actually do you find sufficient and appropriate from your perspective?
What a great question, Christabel. Um, I think the first thing I want to say is that trauma is on a continuum with stress. So I want to define the two of them together. And stress is really nothing more than the mind and body's response when it has appraised that we are under threat or challenge. It is mobilizing a tremendous amount of energy to be able to cope with that challenge. And that is at a low level or a very high level, and it shifts into very high arousal levels into the zone of trauma when the part of our brain, which I talk about as the survival brain, that's the part of the brain that is assessing, constantly assessing, is this situation safe or dangerous? And when it's saying, yes, it's dangerous, it sends lots of signals through the body to start turning on this energy mobilization process. Um, when it also is appraising us to be helpless, powerless, or lacking control in the situation. So it's not just appraising the danger, but also appraising our capacity to kind of meet that danger effectively. And if it finds us to be helpless, powerless, or lacking control in some way, then it moves into this very high arousal level and the kinds of ripple effects through the mind and body that are trauma. One of the biggest of those is that at that very high arousal level, the thinking brain functions that allow us to make conscious decisions, that allow us to encode explicit memory, all of those functions go offline. And that's one of the reasons why our memories of traumatic events might be really sketchy or inconsistent or even missing. Um, and yet, at those super high arousal levels, the survival brain is learning and remembering a whole lot because its whole purpose is to help us be safe to survive. So it's encoding all kinds of stimuli from those moments of traumatic stress. And in the future, it is going to go back to those moments as key moments that it's going to generalize from. So it's one of the reasons why, after we've experienced trauma, we can have responses that we don't know why we're having that response. Our thinking brain wasn't fully online during that event. It doesn't really know what's going on. From the thinking brain's perspective, we're safe and we're alive now. But from the survival brain's perspective, it has encoded that this was a situation that I was not able to defend myself successfully. And so it keeps going back to that moment and seeing it in future times. And that's what makes trauma so challenging to work with and so challenging to transform and heal.
As an extension of that question, I'm curious if, in using these terms, survival brain and thinking brain, are we talking about the common trauma physiology or trauma aspects of neurobiology, sympathetic, parasympathetic components of the autonomic nervous system, or is it broader than that?
It's broader than that. So there is in the decision making literature, in the kind of cognitive neuroscience world that has looked at decision making, that the term, the dual processing model of decision making that Daniel Kahneman really popularized starting in the 1970s and forward. If you're familiar with the book Thinking Fast and Slow, that was his big bestseller. He talks about our decision making with this thinking fast and thinking slow pathway. And I like to think about those two pathways in terms of thinking brain functions and survival brain functions. This is overlapping wiring in the brain. It's not like you can point to particular points of the brain that say this is thinking brain and that's survival brain. But I'm using the terms to highlight that they are different functions that are differently affected by stress arousal, and then they're differently online or offline depending upon the level of arousal we're having. So the thinking brain functions are the things that control our ability to pay attention, to make plans and follow through on them, to make decisions, to access willpower, to use speech. All of those are thinking brain functions. And we have explicit memory that we can kind of call up intentionally. That's a thinking brain function. All of that begins to get degraded when we're experiencing chronic stress over a chunk of time. So, like when we're sleep deprived or jet lagged or dealing with a chronic tension in a relationship, that can begin to wear on those functions. It's why willpower isn't so available when we're feeling stressed and anxious. Survival brain functions are the most important of them is this unconscious threat appraisal process I was talking about called neuroception. And it has its own memory bank that's unconscious. It's an implicit memory bank, all the prior moments in neuroception that it's comparing to. So in this moment, is this safe or not? It's comparing to prior moments of that. And that's why these prior trauma events are so important. And then it controls and drives the nervous system. So if that neuroception, the result in any moment of the external or internal environment, the survival brain says, is this threatening? And it says, yep. Then it's going to turn on the sympathetic nervous system to start arousing stress. And if that isn't enough and it's perceiving us to be helpless, powerless, or lacking control, it's also going to turn on the dorsal parasympathetic, which is part of what's needed to make the freeze response for trauma. If it's perceiving us to be safe, then it says, nope, we're safe, we can stand down. And then it's turning on the ventral parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest and recovery branch that allows us to do all the recovery functions and eat and sleep and digest and all of those things.
So it's broader and also primary to or causal to those more surface level.
It is causal
Yeah.
too.
Okay. That's great. That's great to know. Thank you. Another important piece of your work and phrase that you use that we should define here is the window of tolerance to stress.
Yes. So the window of tolerance to stress arousal, we each have one, and it is the width of it is determined over our life experiences. When we are inside our window of tolerance, we're at the arousal level that allows both our thinking brain functions and our survival brain functions to be fully online. So we're not at high arousal levels where thinking brain functions have gone offline. And importantly, when we're also in our window, we also have the capacity to have our social engagement skills online, which is one aspect of the nervous system when it is in its safety mode. So that's what allows us to connect with and support others. And so everybody's window is different. When we're experiencing chronic stress without recovery, or very big traumatic events, and we're not getting recovery, our window can narrow. And what happens then is that we're spending more of our time outside our window where our thinking brain is either degraded or offline, or our survival brain is hijacking. And so we're kind of being driven by our stress and emotions, or we're self-medicating. So our window is very important for our ability to function effectively and to go through stress and then be able to recover from it each time.
Bringing this round to the MFit training that you created, this course to build resilience and thrive during stress, you say it draws from three lineages: mindfulness training, the warrior traditions, and somatic-based trauma therapies. Would love to hear more about sort of why these three, and particularly about the warrior traditions. That's inspiring to me.
Yes, this is where it kind of is an idiosyncratic coming from my own lineage piece. So I, as you know, served in the Army, and I am the ninth generation in my family to have served in the U.S. Army. My sister and I are the first women in the lineage, but yeah, we're 9 generations in. And so as a result, I spent a lot of my lifetime growing up kind of within that understanding. And as I began to learn more about how the mind and body work, how the key leverage points are both where we're directing our attention, because that affects how the survival brain is perceiving, ripples then into the nervous system and the body, but also what we're doing in a repeated way. So much of our mind and body is affected by our repeated experiences. They affect the wiring of our brain, they affect the wiring of our muscles, they affect our nervous system responses. And when I began to understand that neuroscience side, I realized, wait a minute, the warrior traditions have been around on the planet for millennia, and they've been very, very focused on mind body practices that someone does in a consistent, repeated way on a path to mastery. And the whole point of them is to build the capacity to be able to meet whatever's happening, even really unpleasant things, and meet it with wisdom and courage. Those are the two big values and qualities that these different pathways develop. And those two qualities are common across all the warrior traditions, across all the different cultures through time and around the planet. And so I really became very interested in how people who are going to be serving, and that's the goal of the warriors, to serving their communities, defending people who might not be able to defend themselves, why they focused on mind body qualities and why they focused on those two particular qualities, and how training the mind and body really provides that for us. And as I got to know more about the way the mind and body work from the stress and trauma science side, I began to see how these two things really, that ancient lineage really helped kind of give a grounding to it. And since I came from a warrior lineage and was initially starting to build the training and wanted to share it initially with people who were in the uniform, that was a lineage and understanding and framing that made sense for them too.
Thanks, Liz. And I just want to follow up here. You mentioned a near-death experience. And I'm hearing you speak a lot about mind body, mind body. Is there a spirit aspect here for you?
That is a wonderful question. That could be a whole other conversation. For now, I will say we are much more than just a mind and a body. Our mind is a tool. The intellect is a tool. Many of us have invested a whole lot in it, and we have built our identity around it. But the more I have engaged these practices, the more I realize that awareness is bigger than and encompasses all of it. Awareness doesn't reside just in the thinking brain or the survival brain or the body. That conscious awareness is bigger than and can be aware of all of those pieces. And when I did have that near-death experience, I had stopped breathing and was in the process of being resuscitated, and was in a tunnel and heading into light, and had a voice tell me that I needed to come back to my body. But that process of then coming back into the body and having awareness kind of looking then back out of my eyes, it left a very visceral response in my body. I can even feel it right now as I'm talking about it, that this body and this particular brain, this is not who I am. This is the vehicle that I can be moving through right now, and we are more than that.
It feels, Liz, from you sharing this, there's a sort of palpable feel, as we'd say, to that, and even maybe some emotionality. It must have been an incredibly powerful experience for you.
It really was. Yeah, it was a life-changing moment. It really was.
In your MFit, you teach about the 5 core capacities of mind fitness. Just to give people a sense of the kind of training you've put together, could you talk just briefly about each of these key points, these 5 core capacities of mind?
Yes, I don't have the list right in front of me. I might get the wording a little different than the wording of the list that you might be looking at. But again, the goal here is building core capacities that we can use in any situation. The idea is that they are fungible, that we can use them everywhere. And they include attention, the ability to intentionally direct our attention and sustain it somewhere, not get pulled by distractions, to have some baseline level of attentional stability. Emotional intelligence and emotion regulation, the ability to recognize emotions in ourselves and in others, often through their nonverbal behavior, and to regulate our emotions so that our emotions are not driving our decisions or driving our behavior, but also to be able to use emotions skillfully to connect with other people. Mental agility, the ability to be able to take information that might be a little curveballish and pull it in and use it effectively so that we don't get caught in very rigid plans, but that we're able to take advantage of new information and pivot if necessary, to have that kind of adaptability and flexibility in our moving through the world. Self-regulation, the ability to regulate our emotions, our physical sensations, our stress response, and also our pain, and to use skills that where we're directing our attention really has these ripple effects. So directing our attention in ways that allow us to downregulate emotions when we're stress arousal, when it's getting in the way. And also when we're very low energy, to be able to upregulate so that we have the energy we need. And then finally, situational awareness, which in most contexts is normally thought of as like the world out there, what's going on, what's the terrain, what's going on with other people. But a big component of situational awareness is being aware of what's happening inside of us so that we're taking those cues and letting them be important inputs in our decisions. This one was actually a really hard one for me because after so many decades of just shoving stuff under and not listening to my body and treating my body as kind of this other alien mess that was constantly causing all this problem, and being sick, but, getting in the way of what my mind wanted to do, there was actually an immense amount of information and intuition that I was cutting myself off of because of that. It was a cost of that kind of shoving it under. So learning to listen to those interior messages and let them be a really important input in understanding our limits and understanding our needs and our preferences so that we can make the right choices for ourselves. So the training overall, it's an 8-module course. The first 4 modules are very much focused on building the basic skills and self-regulation in our own mind and body. And then the second 4 modules are focusing more outwards. So using self-regulation interpersonally, being able to use emotional intelligence effectively interpersonally, being able to both minimize the likelihood that we're going to pick up stress and emotions from others, but also use our resilience to help co-regulate others around us, because as social animals, we are always resonating like that, and to be able to move through conflict more effectively. So that's kind of the breakdown of the course. And there's a slow, gradual sequence of building attentional control and building the ability to tolerate challenge in the mind and body. Because if we've been stressed, there's a lot of uncomfortable emotions and uncomfortable sensations that we've got to work our way through. We have to bring them into awareness and allow our body to discharge them, to come back into our window of tolerance. So building that slowly so we don't inadvertently flood and freak out the survival brain, but over time, widening our window.
You're talking about something really important here, Liz, particularly when you mentioned that one struggle you had with what it is to connect to the body and to be listening to what the body's actually telling us. And there's heavy societal conditioning, but I'm sure also with many of the profiles of individuals you're working with, sort of military veterans with probably quite severe PTSD in many instances, the dynamic of what it is to learn to hear our bodies. And this is, in our work, we find this, we might use the term embodiment or coming more and more into the body. But I would think, and it'd be interesting to hear you speak on this, it might be even more exaggerated in a culture whereby the body is trained as a survival piece, and the mind as well, right? I'm thinking of that very heavy conditioning for survival in sort of armed forces environments. And I'd love to hear you talk to that a little bit more.
So we each have within us the capacity. This is going to sound a little circuitous, but I am answering the question, Christabel. We have each within us this capacity for fight response, to turn towards and approach something threatening and handle it face on, or flight response, which is moving away from it to safety. Or when those aren't working, we can fall back to the older response of freeze, where our system just begins to shut down, and that can sometimes be what's needed if the other two aren't going to work. And in people who choose to work in very high stress environments, high demand environments, they often have, and there's empirical research that bears this out, and certainly anecdotally in the groups that I've worked with, this bears out. People who are drawn to working in those kinds of environments often have narrowed windows from childhood, where their system is used to always being completely on, kind of in that stuck on high way of going. And as a result, they're usually good at moving toward, and they have an exaggerated fight response in terms of that particular response is so deeply conditioned in their system. They are used to using, as you put it, their mind and body as a tool that way, very much fighting for survival. And that response is great in crisis. That response is not particularly appropriate in 95% of daily life. And so there's this big mismatch then. And then their system is constantly kind of assuming there's going to be something threatening around the corner. And it leads to very hyper vigilant, excessive startle, and an inability to just sort of settle when things are more quiet. Their system is constantly assuming something is there, and it creates a mismatch that can actually be extremely isolating, because it's hard for people in that state to then connect with someone else and to feel safe enough to really connect with someone else. So a big part of the process is both helping them first to begin to recognize all these cues from their body are not necessarily a sign that they need to be amping up for the next thing, that sometimes these cues are actually part of the process for starting the discharge and recovery. But then to also begin to learn to tolerate, and it requires building a tolerance, tolerate the everything is okay in this moment. This moment is relatively safe. This moment is relatively stable and grounded. And to tolerate that and not have their survival brain begin to second guess and say, oh, this must be just, the calm before the storm. That takes a real rewiring, and it's very uncomfortable for people that are very used to always going and always being able to move and go, to learn to settle back and to tolerate safety. And I know that sounds really paradoxical, but it's a very important shift that has to happen.
When we are going through training people to do healing work, the fundamental thing we teach is basically the core of meditation practice of learning to witness, and witness with the quality of maintaining neutrality to whatever arises. And that naturally brings a person into contact with the very same thing you're talking about, which is, even if things are uncomfortable, learning to be okay with discomfort. But it's not, the way in which that happens is not to actually be the discomfort. It's to learn to have almost this term I like to use lately, the metacognition of seeing that you can watch your discomfort but not be the discomfort at the same time. Do you employ meditation or use the language of meditation in the training that you do?
One of the three lineages is mindfulness training, and there certainly is cultivating mindful awareness. I wouldn't say that we use the traditional language of meditation per se, but all of those ideas are embedded in understanding how to be able to hold in awareness without judgment whatever is arising, without necessarily identifying with it, in your words, to sort of have that witnessing capacity. One of the ways that MFIT is very different from most mindfulness-based training is the order in which we're teaching target objects of attention. So most mindfulness training begins with awareness of breathing. We don't introduce awareness of breathing until 5 weeks in. in large part because the breath is so implicated in the autonomic nervous system and in unresolved memory capsules. And for people who have experienced prolonged stress exposure or trauma that has not yet recovered from it, this was my own personal experience when I first started learning how to meditate. I would send my body, paying attention to breathing would send me into these massive panic attacks. And then I would have days of, heightened symptoms and not know what was going on. And none of my teachers at that time could explain to me what was going on. I mean, I now understand that was whatever you bring awareness to is going to get amplified. And I had had a near-death experience where I stopped breathing and had to be resuscitated. Of course, there was a lot of trauma in my breathing. But that was not, part of the way. It took me many years to understand that. So even with people who don't think that they have capital T trauma, if you've experienced prolonged periods of time of helplessness and powerlessness, breathing is implicated. And so we don't go to awareness of breathing. We go to other target objects that are very good grounding cues for the survival brain to be able to perceive, oh, right now, in this now, I am safe, I am stable, I am grounded. And then over time building up to being able to direct some attention at breathing.
Thank you, Liz, for mentioning that sort of trauma without the capital T, as it were. We just interviewed a fellow practitioner who uses the phrase, there's no hierarchy to trauma. There's so much unidentified trauma, lowercase t, that is so misunderstood. And as you said, people having experienced in their life extended periods of powerlessness or helplessness. I'd love if you could share some of the sort of cultural norms, maybe the American cultural norms out of fairness, which are impeding our people's resiliency, outside of this very specialized niche of sort of military and veteran work.
Yes. We have such an interesting relationship in American culture with stress and trauma. Stress is generally something that is considered a badge of honor of some sort. To be able to say I'm stressed sort of is also conveying the message that I'm important and I'm busy and I'm successful. And, people brag about how little sleep they got or how many, years it's been since they've taken a real vacation, and those things are considered to be great. And then in the social media world, since social media has existed, now there's FOMO, and so it makes it even like people feel like they have to be on 24/7. And so stress gets romanticized. But at the same time, trauma is pretty much disowned. I mean, we have this cultural sense of, okay, if you were in a mass school shooting or you experienced rape or you experienced, combat, those we'll all agree those are traumas, and those are like worthy capital T traumas. But most people are experiencing traumatic stress in environments that are significantly less kind of extreme than that. It is very easy for a survival brain to perceive itself to be helpless, powerless, or lacking control in conditions that, looking at from the outside, you might not even think of as traumatic, but it isn't what our thinking brain is judging it as or what someone else's thinking brain is judging it as. Whether we're experiencing trauma or not is not up to our thinking brains, and it's not up to our collective thinking brain narratives that exist in the media or, as we're taught in school. It's up to our survival brain's perceptions. And so, my father, just to use a very concrete example that most people wouldn't necessarily think of as traumatic stress, my dad did several tours in Vietnam. He had PTSD himself. Like, everyone would say those parts were traumatic. Those are not things my dad thinks of as the trauma in his life. For him, the thing that's been so traumatic was my mother's Alzheimer's disease and watching her decline and coming to terms with when we had to move her into memory care. He was completely helpless and powerless in those situations. And yet no one would think of kind of caring for a sick family member necessarily as trauma. And yet my dad swam in trauma for years and is still, she's she's still here and very far advanced disease. And it's very hard to watch what's happening. So it doesn't even have to be something like bullying or racism or sexism. We often think of those kinds of identity things as traumatic, and they are. But I wanted to use an example that, whatever our system is perceiving as helpless and powerless and causing us to feel lack of control. I worked with a woman who was passed over for a promotion by a younger male colleague. He got the promotion that she didn't. And it sent her into this, really big traumatic reenactment from earlier in her life, and sent her back into coping behaviors from, when she had been an early teen, tween, and she couldn't understand what was happening. And it took really explaining, no, you've just been through this massive trauma. But no one around her would think of that. And her thinking brain didn't think of that as traumatic.
I think that's so helpful to just really level the field there regarding trauma. And it doesn't matter what it looks like from the outside, it's what we're experiencing from the inside. And really important to honor the challenging situations we have in life and just take them for what they are and work with them rather than think that it should be this, that, or the other. It is what it is, right? You brought up stuff with your dad just now, but also mentioned about how these things affect family. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how parental stress levels may affect the health and well-being of their children. For instance, given that you're 9 generations, right, deep in terms of military service, does that mean that you're a much higher candidate to have PTSD again, so to speak, or do you inherit things, the predilection towards, like how might we think about that?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And because of my long lineage, I was particularly interested in that. Like I knew my grandfather who fought in World War II in the Pacific, and then he was in the occupation force after World War II in Germany, and then he fought in the Korean War. So he had lots of his own combat experience. Also, raging PTSD that was long before the diagnosis existed, but he was coping with it the best he knew how. It clearly had ripple effects on my dad. Then my dad, experienced Vietnam. So I saw that in my own lineage, and I wanted to understand how and why that works. And there's several pathways by which parents are affecting the wiring of the minds and bodies of their offspring. Some of that, I think some of this is still cutting edge research. In the last 15 years, there's been a real understanding now of epigenetics, the ability of the way that our repeated experiences affect which genes get turned on and which proteins surrounding DNA get turned on, so that we can upregulate or downregulate in ways that can be beneficial or not. And the research with humans certainly shows grandparents through parents to grandchildren that there are certain effects that can create, as you put it, a predilection towards anxiety disorders or depression or real changes in the stress hormone profile of those people, exaggerated likelihood of experiencing physical ailments that are related to chronic arousal in terms of chronic inflammation diseases, both physical and mental diseases affiliated with chronic inflammation, and all of it coming back to kind of upregulation in their immune system that gets passed through multiple generations. With rodent research, they're showing now 5 generations of links, that the trauma started with the great great grandfather mouse or rat, and then down to the 5th generation. And the other 4 generations had no trauma exposure. Rodent research is great because they have shorter lifespans and they can have a very controlled environment, harder to control for humans. But to really show that this epigenetic effects can have a long-term effect. So that's one pathway. But a second pathway is, if parents have narrowed windows from their own unresolved stress and own unresolved trauma, they are living in a chronically activated state themselves. They are not downregulating. And the nervous systems and brains of their children are beginning to wire off the contact with their parents. And so if the parents are in a constantly dysregulated state, that child is not getting an opportunity to wire regulation in. We are born with our sympathetic nervous system. That's the turn stress on part. That's fully online. And we're born with our dorsal parasympathetic. That's the one that controls freeze. That's fully online. But the ventral parasympathetic nervous system, we don't start wiring that until the very end of pregnancy and through our childhood into about 18 years old. And that part of the nervous system, it's initially wired through all of the breastfeeding, the sucking motions involved in nursing, and then in the contact with parents. If we don't have a parent who's regulated, we don't wire our ventral parasympathetic nervous system. This was certainly I had very bad colic. My dad had his PTSD. My mom was dealing with her own traumas. And I had colic. I wasn't being breastfed, and I didn't end up, that was a big part of why my window was so narrow for so long. So we don't know how to do the recovery functions when we're born. We know how to turn it on. We know how to go into freeze. We don't know how to do recovery. And we're initially supposed to be learning that through parents, that we experience distress, they soothe us, and that kind of pairing of we have distress, someone soothes us, we begin to internalize that so we can soothe and downregulate ourselves. But if our parents' windows are narrow, we might not be getting that. And that then also can both set for insecure attachment styles and then also set a narrow window for later in life.
It's fascinating, Liz, how so much of what you're touching base on, it really connects to what we would refer to as intergenerational healing, and this is across traditions across the world, right? Ancient traditions and cultures. And I'm very intrigued as to whether these studies will eventually show that the 7 generations that's upheld by so many ancient traditions is the number that they land at in terms of, this is where we can break the cycle, as it were. I'd love to bring some sort of practical tips to our listeners. You're talking here very eloquently about this relationship with parent-child and inherited trauma. Let's say a person's listening. They know that a wider window is associated with resilience. How can we widen our window? What are the things people can do?
Wonderful question. One of the most important things that we can do to widen our window is not sexy, but it is sort of the single best one we can do without regular practice. It's getting enough sleep. We do so much of our recovery time while we're sleeping. It gives our thinking brain a chance to be offline for a bit, and we do all kinds of rebuilding, and the nervous system does recovery. The survival brain gets a chance to really do some deep recovery. So ideally, at least 7.5 or 8 hours every single night. Much of the research shows like you can't just make it up on the weekends. Like the imbalances really happen if we're not doing it consistently. So sleep is the number one easiest one. And setting life habits to support getting that amount of sleep, I think, is the single one thing I would say. But I think there's several others in terms of training attention and awareness. There are several cues that really do support the survival brain interrupting what's happening and being able to neuroset safety to support recovery. And the 2 that I would mention to your listeners right now, and they can go to my website and get a 5-minute audio guided practice from my website that would give them kind of a guided practice for this. But the 2 that are most important are first, the sensations of contact between the body and our environment. So the weightedness of the butt and the backs of the legs in the chair, the bottoms of the feet in contact with the floor, or the hands, touching the lap. Directing attention to one of these over and over, if it wanders off, coming back, that really is an attentional cue that shows the survival brain that we're grounded and stable. And it can then start turning on. It perceives safety. It turns on those recovery functions in the nervous system. The other one that's really good is orienting to our environment. And it's really important to be moving head and neck. Your listeners can't see me that I'm showing it, but moving the head and neck, because that cues and turns on the ventral parasympathetic nervous system. So moving the head and neck and really connecting with what you're seeing, identifying and really noticing things in the environment that are neutral or pleasant, and really picking up what's neutral or pleasant. Same with sound. You can be moving head and neck and orienting to neutral and pleasant sounds. That too is really good for sending cues to turn on the recovery functions. So that would be an attentional thing. The third would be to recognize how much we are resonating with our environment. And so really taking some time to disconnect from the electromagnetic spectrum, putting down the doom scrolling, turning off the television, spending time in nature. Nature is super regulating, can be really helpful. Just even 10 minutes walking outside, feeling the air on our face, it can have a tremendous shift. And then the last two I would say are diet and exercise. 70% of our immune system lives in our gut, and our gut produces 95% of our serotonin, which is one of the very important neurotransmitters for ADHD and anxiety and depression and PTSD and insomnia and migraines. And so if our microbiome is balanced, we are really setting the epigenetics of our gut, our microbiome, to help build resilience. And when our microbiome is imbalanced, it can really have big resilience minimizing effects. So, and then exercise. When we get physical exercise where we're slightly out of breath for a chunk of time each day, it really does help our system to downregulate some of the stress hormones that might already be coursing through our body. It might not be a full recovery, but it does give us some amount of resettling, in addition to just it produces endorphins and we might feel better.
Your work extends into the spheres of both war and peace. And some of the application is of MFIT and the training that you do is for people who are actually active in serving in the military, for example, to be able to be more present so they can have clear decision making. Could you talk a little bit about how your work informs this polarity of war and peace in a practical sense?
I initially got interested in being able to share this when I saw my own effects in my own life, but at the same time, I was working at that point on my dissertation and turning it into a book. It was looking at the process of ending wars and especially the politics behind ending wars. And at that time, we were in Iraq and Afghanistan, and there were some studies that had been done by psychologists that worked for the US government, and that they had surveyed troops who had served on the ground in both of those conflicts. And one of the really striking findings for me from that study was men and women who had been on the ground who identified as either having anxiety or depression or PTSD or some other mental health disorder. They were also 3 times more likely to say that they had engaged in unethical behavior while they were deployed. They had either harmed non-combatants or they had harmed personal property, or they had acted in ways that were really scary to the local population, even if it wasn't in the middle of a firefight. And that finding really stuck with me. There's a lot of reasons why narrowed windows are associated with challenges with ethical behavior, and I'm working on some research on that right now. But it really has a real effect on not just the course of the conflict and their behavior during the conflict, which might lead to war crimes or behavior that is really, not in line with international laws of war. But that kind of behavior and the effects of it can lead to longer term kind of regret or difficulties with reconciliation when a conflict ends. And when you look at, I teach about international security, and so I track so many different conflicts on the planet right now, and you see people who are really in distress and the way that they take it out on their adversaries, which is sometimes people who are in the same village, and then at the end of the war, they're supposed to go back to being. And that reconciliation process and the rebuilding of those societies is so much harder because of that. I think it's really incumbent upon us to not just help the warriors who are going to perhaps fight in or be peacekeepers in different conflicts, but to help build kind of baseline resilience in societies at war so that they are more likely to achieve some kind of a lasting peace that can be sustainable after a conflict ends. I'm doing a lot of work right now in Ukraine with Ukrainians, teaching on Zoom at this point because getting into the country is not very easy. But many of the people that we're working with are business leaders, community leaders, care providers, first responders in different towns that have been really decimated through the different shellings and drone attacks and other things. And many of them are spending a chunk of time at the front or working at the front all the time. And seeing how just the capacity to help their system feel safe enough in a moment to downregulate and to begin to reconnect with the people that they're with. They've been living, the war has been at this point, it's 12 years old. I mean, it started 10 years old. It started in 2014, but since the invasion in 2022, there's been no spelling people at the front. They've had no rotations. They're just exhausted. They've been fighting for more than 2 years. And the degree of symptoms is just, it's overwhelming. And to see how you wouldn't think it could make a big difference, but just the capacity to arrive in a moment and feel safe enough in that moment. It might not be forever, but in that moment, safe enough for their system to breathe and settle and to begin to then shift how they're seeing things and reconnect with people around them. It's been really powerful work for us and an honor for us to be helping them. And it's given me a new, this isn't just an idealistic thing. Like this really works. But it requires both an understanding of what's going on and then a willingness to experiment with and see, can this really work? And it can, but people need to be willing to try.
If people want to find you, what do you suggest they do? What offerings do you have?
The best way to find me, I am not on social media. It's a conscious choice, so they won't find me there, but they can find my website, elizabeth-stanley.com. They can get a download of the contact points exercise that I shared, and they can access the MFIT online course, which is available on demand. And I do monthly Q&As and practice sessions. We actually have one tonight. They're free and open to the public, so you can sign up for those. I also run courses on Zoom occasionally. I did one this spring on confronting the polycrisis that we're facing as a planet, and I'll probably be doing another one on a different theme in the fall. So getting on my mailing list is the best way to know what's going on, and I really hope that some of your listeners come find me.
Thank you, Liz. An incredible conversation. I feel like we could talk to you for some time about the incredible work that you're doing. Really appreciate you joining us today and for sharing a little of your wisdom and your experience.
Thank you both for having me. I was so glad when you reached out, and I have really enjoyed this conversation. You asked such thoughtful questions, both of you. I've really enjoyed it. This has been a very, very fast hour for me. So I really appreciate the chance to be here with you.
Thanks for listening to the episode. What really supports the podcast is providing a rating and review of the show on your preferred listening platform. This helps us get the message out to a wider audience. If the topics we discussed today appeal to you, do take a moment to subscribe. Lastly, we invite you to check out our website, fielddynamicshealing.com, to learn about our training programs, private session work, and to see how we're setting the standard in contemporary energy healing. Many thanks, and see you next time.